Joining us now on what semiconductor manufacturing could look like under either a Trump or Harris presidency and the state of the sector globally, Reva Goujon is with us, Rhodium Group director. Reva, there are a lot of implications for all of this, and obviously the reshoring push of the chip industry was in part as a sort of a counterbalance against China and the growth of the industry there for security reasons, for economic reasons. So what are the stakes then of the CHIPS Act with regard to trade between the U.S. and China?
Well, the stakes are high. I mean, this is where we need to see the results of major industrial policy. And so, as Akiko just mentioned, Intel is the biggest recipient of CHIPS Act funding. But Intel, as we've seen, also has some very big challenges internally in being able to deliver on its production pledges. And so this is already creating a lot of consternation, of course, also among industry and policymakers. I agree, though, that the CHIPS Act is extremely unlikely to be repealed. There is bipartisan support for industrial policy, especially for chips, but it comes down to results. And TSMC is still by far the biggest market leader here. At the same time, there are security frictions over Taiwan. You've seen Trump as well engage in a lot of rhetoric over how he would basically engage in very transactional negotiations with Taiwan as well. So the stakes are high for TSMC when it comes to potential pushes to diversify away from Taiwan and draw in investment into the United States.
Reva, I take you at your word that, you're not going to see a repeal of the CHIPS Act. When Speaker Johnson's, kind of elaborated and clarified his comments, what he said was he wanted to streamline that bill. He talked about eliminating costly regulations, Green New Deal requirements. I mean, are there ways, in your opinion, to maybe do just that, to have a bill that's more effective, that's smarter?
Well, so there's a push-pull here between Democrats and Republicans, right? Where Democrats are demanding more transparency over how these negotiations are going with companies, what are the actual conditions and the final agreements. And there are controversial labor and environmental standards that were part of these deals, which many Republicans have also been attacking. So one important thing to keep in mind is that we've actually seen some pragmatism out of the Biden administration in realizing that these chip fabs are not going to be built on this kind of timeline if they don't start accelerating things. And so there have already been compromises, for example, on environmental reviews, where fabs are not going to need National Environmental Policy Act reviews. And so that's all meant to kind of accelerate this process. So in terms of trying to shore up the CHIPS Act, I would see those kinds of provisions being targeted, but not the overall strategic goal of getting funding behind bolstering chip manufacturing in the United States.
And Reva, I want to get to the other sort of part of all of these endeavors, which is not just bolstering the domestic industry, but also tech controls on imports of Chinese technology, for example. How do you see that playing out under each of the administrations?
Yeah, technology controls targeting China are going to be a major feature of either administration, but some differences as well, right? So if you consider Trump administration, we saw, of course, the U.S. calling out Chinese theft of U.S. IP. That resulted in the Section 301 report, a barrage of tariffs, targeting of major Chinese tech champions like Huawei. But let's be honest, it was a pretty haphazard approach. And so Biden administration, think of that as phase two. That was really about cleanup and build toward a more coherent technology controls framework. And now, when we come to this election, we basically have a loaded weapon and technology controls. The question now is how those measures are applied. And so for a Harris administration, it's easy to say, okay, Harris is status quo Biden. But a Harris administration would be in a fundamentally different phase of tech controls, again, in how those are applied. And as we get away from, of course, chip controls are still in focus, and patching up those controls remains a very big priority. But we've gone beyond that now, right? To restricting investment channels, to restricting China's access to high performance compute through cloud. And now we are in this much more diffuse realm of data security and cybersecurity controls. And most recently, you've seen this with restrictions around connected vehicles. There will be more targets. So I think that is the next phase to come. And under a Trump administration, you would see a much more blunt approach to everything I just described. An assumption that industry will adapt, a targeting potentially of major Chinese tech champions. And this is where we really have to think hard about Chinese retaliation as well.
What could Chinese retaliation look like, do you think, Reva?
Well, so there are really two big implications to all this. On the Chinese retaliation side, we've already seen where China doesn't have a great symmetric response to technology controls. It's not where it has much leverage, but it does have leverage in critical inputs to those supply chains. And so it's already highlighted those threats through its own export controls. Those could be exercised in a much more assertive way. You could see disruptions in the M&A space, especially as there are pressures on the semiconductor industry to consolidate, again, with Intel showing some real problems. And that's where SAMR, China's anti-monopoly arm, could create some big disruption. Most concerning, of course, is if we see retaliation in the security sphere, where you see some spillover here. In the case of maximalist technology controls targeting China, where Beijing starts to feel cornered and in an existential crisis, this is where we have to worry about that tech war spilling over into the security sphere, primarily with a focus on Taiwan. And this is where, of course, the global semiconductor supply chain could be put in jeopardy if we get to that scenario. So that's a big difference between a Harris and a Trump administration when we look at that risk and what would be the guardrails around that risk.
And so for U.S. investors, I mean, obviously, you know, there's some of this is more binary than others in terms of the differences between the two potential administrations. But what do investors need to consider here when it comes to companies that are chip adjacent or tech adjacent to all of this that are based in the U.S.? I mean, how, considering, do they just wait until after tomorrow maybe to you know, kind of make their investment decisions?
Well, one, it's important to understand what underlies either administration, right? When it comes to the application of these technology controls, in some areas, there's not that much difference. It's really just how they're implemented. But yeah, spillovers matter, right? The nature of how these measures are applied will matter in terms of whether there are phase-in restrictions, for example. When Trump was criticizing the CHIPS Act, he was saying, that was a bad deal because he could have just raised tariffs and then that investment would have come to the U.S. for free, as he said. Well, that also means that you would have to be raising component tariffs because semiconductors are not coming directly to the United States. They're assembled into electronics, right? That gets very, very messy for supply chains. Now on the maybe the more positive side, you know, the U.S. is trying to work toward a strategic vision of cultivating ex-China technology and trade blocs. And it's moving toward this. And under Harris administration, you could see sustained momentum for this with plurilateral negotiations, getting the partner momentum to see that. And there are some opportunities that come with that, of course, in having new trade blocs emerge. But that's a big if. I think that's one of the highest areas where we see big stakes on this election.
Reva, a big important topic. Thank you so much for helping us think through it.
Thank you.